Hello, everyone, and welcome to Conversations on Sex, Addiction, and Relationships. I'm Tim Stein, and today I'm joined with my friends Dan Drake, Jeannie Vitoni, and Wendy Conquest. We have a really exciting episode for you today. Today, our guest is Dr. Patrick Carnes. We refer to him as the father of sex addiction treatment and understanding sex addiction. And we have all trained under Pat, and so he is very much our mentor, and we are thrilled to have him on the show today. Guys, what are your thoughts about Pat coming on and getting to spend a little time talking with him?
I'm super excited to have Pat on. Um, Listening, he is such a great speaker and storyteller, as well as such a wonderful person. And for us to have him here so that others can, and the listeners can get to know him a bit, I'm super thrilled. A little nervous, but super thrilled.
Well, from time to time, as new clients come in and also betrayed partners, the question is, well, this thing, sex addiction, is it a real thing or not? I don't know. Is it just an excuse for bad behavior? And so to have Dr. Carnes on today and to hear from him directly, why this is why this is a valid addiction, and how this came to be. I'm really really happy about that.
And I'm really excited to have Pat on as well. I don't know if people realize, but it wasn't that long ago that sex addiction wasn't even a recognized term. And if anyone is not aware, it was one person that bravely was willing to do research and call this a real thing. So what we have today in the 2024 is as a result of one man being bravely willing to do the work. So I'm really grateful to have him on and share his wisdom with us.
I'm looking forward to this, and as I am so in awe of Pat and all that he has done, but I also want to share that I have the honor of working with Pat on a few other projects outside, and so I know him a little bit. And this morning he called me up and said, "So are we supposed to do something today?" Just to joke with me and get me nervous about if he was actually going to be here. And then when he first came on and we were doing our pre-recording stuff, and Jeannie, you said, "Oh yeah, I work with Tim at Willow Tree Counseling," and Pat's response was, "I'm sorry." So there's this wonderful person who has done so much for this community, but there's also this wonderful jokester, just very human person that I have the honor and I'm so appreciative that I get to connect with him in some way. And I'm looking forward to this conversation. Pat, you want to join us?
Dun, dun, dun.
We're here.
Yay!
Welcome.
Welcome,
Thank
sir.
you.
Welcome, Pat.
Appreciate the invitation. And I think one fact about me is that I've noticed as I've aged is that I'm going to be 80 in another couple of weeks. And what I've noticed as I get older is I don't think it is a jokester. I think it's kind of a trickster.
Uh-huh.
And I find that Native American tradition of the medicine man who turns into being a trickster, it really starts happening, and it's because you get to a point where you don't care. I think that's kind of what happens. But so you're willing to take risks, and sometimes humor is an easier way to take sorrow and harder things. And then it's like a lemon drop. You can crunch it and do it right away, or you can suck it and let it just dissolve. And I find that humor is a way of approaching the lemon drop and just letting it resolve. So there's a part of me that has enjoyed that side of myself that is available to me now in a way that it wasn't even 10 years ago. So I think you're right. I love teasing Tim because
It's so easy.
He opens the door, you gotta walk through.
yeah. So, but I love him dearly, so it's a good thing. We have a great relationship,
Well,
and
thank you for taking the risk and coming on our podcast and
yeah,
talking with us.
yes, yes, I threatened all of you with, if we start bringing all the issues that we have to this table, and it could be quite an exciting podcast. But I've assured Tim I'm not going to say everything right.
Can we start, Pat, from the beginning? Like, how did this all start?
Well, I've been thinking about that a lot lately because I find myself in a very, very interesting cross section of my life. Uh, much of much of my career, as Dan noted, was uh, taking on the culture and the mental health community, various branches of professional um, groups, and making the argument that there was a thing called sex addiction. And I've always thought about myself as that it's about my quest has been about trying to help adults, and we've made extraordinary progress. You four are all certified sex addiction therapists. Well, now there's thousands of you, and the diagnosis uh, going towards the DSM-6 is that's going to happen. I know what's going to happen, and that there are too many people working and establishing connections now. And we didn't have the scientific, when I started, we didn't have some of the instrumentation or the ways of seeing how the brain works. So we're in a very different position. I mean, I no longer feel apologetic about it. And people say there's no evidence, and there is a wealth of evidence and a lot of documentation. And I think we're at a space where we don't need to be embarrassed by talking about it or apologetic that this is what we do. But when I started, it was like uh, there was there was real fear and resistance around that concept. I have to remember when I started, uh, I was trained in an environment in which they didn't want to put alcoholics and drug addicts in the same group because, in fact, they were different issues. And alcohol, the alcoholics were a more elite group than the drug addicts, and they shouldn't be in the same space as the skid row drug addict. And that was a real time that there was professional uh, spats about this, and the idea of putting all substance abusers in the same thing, and recognizing they're doing the same thing and that they probably do all the above. That didn't exist when we started. Um, but the thing that I think that is for me ironical is that we are now in an age where a foundation that Tim and I both work with called AFAR. We've been doing gene research in sex addiction, and the realization we had a number of different sets of patients. And we had the 45-year-old white guy, and then one of our comparison groups were over 4,000 multicultural 19-year-olds, 20-year-olds. And when we looked at the gene damage, the dopamine gene damage, there's no differences. And in order for them to get there, that meant that they had to start very early. And so that is a reality, is that, and what we're talking about is really going to hit people between the eyes, because we can talk about heart disease in children. We can talk about cancer in children, and everybody is very compassionate about that. But what they don't realize is that addiction can be in children as well, and that this is being documented all over the world right now in very interesting ways, because they're getting the multiple hits of gaming, being hooked on the internet and devices, and then porn. The evidence is becoming overwhelming about. There's a group of Canadian researchers who had attached AI, artificial intelligence syllogisms, within a monitoring system of kids as they started gaming and what happened to them over a period of 6 months. And what they came up with is that gaming, in many ways, is a finely honed mechanism to change the brain into addictive functioning as coping. And that we are talking now, every hour, 600 kids discover something on the internet sexual. And parenthetically, while I'm talking about addiction, the reality is that a lot of things happen to those 600 kids because of what they find on the internet. But we know pretty accurately about a third of them are going to have a lifelong problem. And that so 200 kids are going to have a problem, and you're going to have between the ages of 12 and 16. And then, but 85 of those kids are going to be under the age of 11. And so, and we can talk about that as the show goes on about what we're learning. But to say that, to think of addiction as a childhood disease, it's going to blow people's minds when that hits the skids here. I'm laying on the x-ray machine in the hospital. I have a shoulder. Somebody thinks I need to have a new one. Mm-hmm. So they were taking pictures of it. And in the hospital, the community hospital here, I've done grand rounds. I know the docs. They know what I'm doing. We talk. Director of nursing walks in. And she says to me, I'm not here about your shoulder. I said, really? What are you here for? I've never met her before. I've heard of her. I don't know, but she's a great leader. And she says, well, most of the nurses are moms. And what we wanted you to know is we know what you're writing and how important it is, because as moms, we are seeing what's happening. And the fact is they turned in their iPads at the end of the semester, and they were so filled with things that they couldn't in good conscience return to the kids They had to either face buying new iPads or a tremendous expense to clean them. And who was going to pay for that? And the problem is they haven't resolved it. We are 5 weeks into the second semester, and all their curriculum are on that are on that after the pandemic. It's all on an iPad, and so the problem is our kids have nothing to do in school because they don't have the things that they've learned to work with. So what you're talking about is really important for people to realize is that is real and it's happening. And that it's basically what we found in our research in Alberta is sex addiction and gaming has reduced the onset of addiction at least 3.5 decades.
Pat, can you say that sentence again?
Between gaming and sex addiction, that and the internet and technology, that we have brought down the age of starting as an addict by 3.5 decades. And that there are kids who are in a lot of trouble by fourth, fifth. And that was true when I started as a clinician. There were cases. I supervised interns, residents, and a 6-year-old girl came in and she was clearly alcoholic and had been drinking since she was about 2 years old. Terrible case of abuse. And she had all the problems, including withdrawal. And so nobody knew how to treat her. And that's a problem because you can't send a 6-year-old off to treatment somewhere for 10 weeks away from her family and her parents. How do we do that? I think there is an answer. But what I would challenge people to think is that from a mental health point of view, there's a lot of mental health professionals aren't going to like the answer about what you have to now do because of what's happening to our children. I would say that the reason that it's ironical for me is that I knew there was something wrong with me when I was 4 or 5 years old. And we had a woman in our neighborhood that abused the whole neighborhood. All the kids, almost all of them were young girls. And I was in that mix. And so, because I was one of the few boys involved in it, I found that a very stimulating, incredible environment. And today we talk about rapid onset by overstimulation sexually before kids developmentally are ready for it. I stimulate. And one of the things that I think, and so I learned to masturbate. I was taught to masturbate. I didn't ejaculate, but I use that. And in my house, one of the universal things we have found in the data set is that domestic violence was one of the precursors. Most sex addicts in our studies are reporting domestic violence. That was part of their growing up. And that was true for me. My dad was violent. I watched him batter my mother, and I also was battered myself. So I realized that I have a lot of compassion for these kids. I mean, I was out to help adults, and now I'm helping children. And the thing is that was me at that time. And I was I was using masturbation as a way just to get through the day because my anxieties were so high. The other thing that I've learned, that we have learned now over time, is if you remember, in your training, you learned about Damasio at the beginning of understanding neuroscience. And if you'll remember, that stuff started because they've started looking at kids with brain damage. And what was interesting to them was is that kids with brain damage had a characteristic that was real intriguing to the researchers, which was they didn't know fear. They had no fear. And so somebody in the meeting with of the group that was researching the children says it's like they're like addicts. And somebody said, well, let's see. And that was the beginning of the very famous Ames, Iowa, University of Iowa studies in the middle 90s. And they took gamblers and it's a famous test of the blue cards and the red cards. Red cards you could win in, and the blue cards you would always lose in. And what they identified is that in the gambling groups, they didn't have a sense of something being wrong that they should stop. In other words, old St. Paul's question, why do I do what I don't want to do? And so the reality is that these kids, and in the gambling studies, they found the words loss chasing behavior. In other words, keeping after something, even though you have repeatedly learned it's not going to work for you. In contrast, the healthy Pete kids learned to use the red deck and not the blue deck. And it was the beginning of understanding. Now, when I as an adult first had my first brain scan, because I wanted to know about the technology and use it with our patients and what have you. And the docs that I did it twice, and each time the physician that was in charge of my case said, were you a better child? And I said, how did you know that? It's just, we can see it. Now, what I have put together also with it is my sister and I were the first candidates for operations on the elliptical muscles of the eyes, which is very near the prefrontal cortex. So when being the first one, of course, they didn't know how to do the surgery at that time, so they were exploring. So there was brain damage. And as a kid, I was a problem to my family. I was a problem because I would do things that made no sense. And so examples, I mean, my family would tell the stories and the stories would come out, things like I drank turpentine when I was found it under the sink. Um, my wading into the water in a Minnesota lake in April, ice is just out in a snowsuit. What kid does that? Getting into a car and experimenting at the age of 4, top of a hill, rolls down the driveway, crashes. I totaled my first car at the age of 4. Fact of the matter is, and then, other things that my family didn't. I fell out of the car with my dad and he was drunk. He didn't notice me. He drove over me. And then he's afraid that he hit me. So then he drove back and he parked the car on top of me. Much later in my life, in my recovery time, I asked my aunt, I said, did you know what was happening? She says, you were constantly in the emergency room, and I could never get your mother to admit or tell me what happened to you. And when you don't know fear, there's nothing that makes you stop to think about what you're doing. And so when that occurs, um, making intelligent choices about what you're doing. So, for example, there's a thing that I love to use with therapists because it's very funny, and you can go on YouTube and see this. And it's the marshmallow test, and basically, it's taking a group of 5-year-olds, and they have a choice. They're given a marshmallow, and they say, "Now, if you, I'll be back in 5 minutes, and if you don't eat that marshmallow, I'll give you another one. You will have 2 marshmallows." Well, there are a number of kids that just couldn't help themselves, but they ate that marshmallow and or nibbled on it or did all kinds of things. And the film is of their struggle with that, which is, very cute and funny and what have you. 40 years later, when they look at it, is the kids who were able to defer gratification because they could see that they'd be better off if they did that, had higher SATs, their socioeconomic status, their success in living life, successful relations, all those things was much more often found in the group that was able to defer and wait for the second marshmallow. So what they were starting to talk about and think about is what we've learned in addiction is behind the prefrontal cortex, where the decisions are made in the brain, that there's a filtering mechanism that allows you to make the decision to defer gratification. And if you're in pain, one of the things that we understand too is it gets very much affected by what we call the reward system of the brain, of which the principal component is a thing called the dopamine or dopaminergic system. And so the reward system becomes very powerful and overwhelms the person's judgment in terms of the next right decision. And so there's a lot that we've learned that the research on understanding the neurochemistry of the brain really started with kids who had damaged brains. And kids now, what we know is happening is there's this kind of varieties of different kinds of sex addicts. There's a classic sex addict, which is one that has usually had parents who were addicted, had trauma growing up, and they had exposure and often were sexually abused, about 3/4 of them, 81%, both men and women. But there was a process we could see. They came from a certain kind of family. They had a certain history. It was very predictable. And by 1995, we knew pretty much what was the process that made an addict. Then came on what we called the superstimulus. And the superstimulus is what we call rapid onset. And what that means is that the brain is so stimulated, it rewires itself very quickly. And so, like, for example, in crystal meth raises your dopamine in your brain 1,100%. Alcohol raises it a 100%. So, in other words, crystal meth is never going to be a recreational drug because what it does is it changes your brain so fast, you're rewired. And in the late 90s, as pornography and the internet progressed, what we'd start to hear is that people would say, it happened so fast. It was like I started and I was lost within weeks. And that rapid onset means that the brain gets rewired. Well, now what we're starting to see is another kind of addict, and there's a type of addict that has rapid onset and fairly early in life with the stimulation of the internet and the stimulation of gaming. And one of the other characteristics, as the Canadians researchers have found, is obesity is a real problem with the gamers. In other words, all of these things are dopamine problems being gathered together in these children. And so the thing that I think is real ironical is you don't think of a kid as an addict, because classically alcohol, even alcohol research though documented 12, 13, 14-year-old alcoholics fairly early. And they made the distinction between essential and reactionary, or primary and secondary alcoholics. And the essential and the primaries were usually on their way by 13 or 14. She took her first drink and suddenly she felt like she could compete with the other girls in her class. It was like there was this perfect feeling that she was now normal. There was something abnormal or missing for her. She didn't feel as pretty. She didn't feel she could compete. But after that first glass, she felt normal. And that's how she wanted to be. And so the fact of the matter is that even in alcoholism, those things they were talking about 14 to 12 years old already in that. So the problem is, how do we talk to the public about this? Because it's a very difficult thing. So I'm putting a boat in the water. I live on right now. I'm up at my cabin in northern Minnesota, and they are putting a boat in the water, and this DNR lady, whose job it is to inspect your boat for invasive species, make sure you're licensed, what have you. She says, "What do you do for a living?" And that's the question I never want to be asked in public. Usually, I avoid that because it leads to conversations I don't want to have, because they all have a relative that they know about, and they all want to talk. So she said, "What do you do?" And I said, "Well, I'm a psychologist." Usually that stops it. And she said, "Well, what do you specialize in anything?" I said, "Yes, I'm an addiction psychologist." And then they say, "Oh, is there a special kind of addiction that you're good at?" And I end up saying, "Well, yes, I work on the sexual medicine side of things, and that sex addiction is what my primary, although I end up dealing with them all." And she says, "Oh, you mean pedophiles?" I said, "No. Pedophiles are actually, there's pedophilia in the dark corners of sex addiction. But it's a very small percentage. Uh, but what people immediately think of is the very worst. And one of the things that our sister foundation in Canada learned in a large study is in explaining addiction to the public. They first had to understand what addiction is before you talk about sex addiction. And so when I talk about it now, I start talking about gaming, and I start talking about the internet. The internet is a very addictive thing. I mean, the average adult looks at their phone 225 times a day. I mean, stop to think about not having your phone, or setting your phone down, or shutting it off. They just don't do that. And how dependent the technology is so wonderful, but also we're totally engrossed in it. And the fact is that it sort of takes over your life when your phone doesn't work. Or I have this watch by Apple that kind of rules my life. And the fact is that I can become obsessed with the thing. People and I don't know if you know the term fubbing. Do you have your heard for fubbing? Fubbing is where a parent ignores or a child ignores other members of the family because they're digitally involved.
Mhm.
So you probably are guilty of fubbing at some point. I mean, we all are. Fubbing is where you're so involved in what you're doing, you're not listening to the people around you. You're
Yeah.
not interacting. And so fubbing is where you're ignoring relationships in order to be digitally involved. And so when you don't talk to your kid and they need something, you fub them. If the kid doesn't talk to you, they fubbed you. It's spelled PHUB, fubbing, and it's a common term in the digital world, because it's a very common experience in the family. But you have to think about the connections in the family and how families use iPads and smartphones and how early people get them. And so the problem is that as we get better at identifying who the sex addicts are and the various varieties, because you have the classic sex addict, you have the rapid onset start uh, uh, early addict, then you have kind of hybrids of both that had the sexual abuse and had the excessive religiosity and had all the things that were with it. So you have all of those things, but what's happening is that those kids, and most of them, we really started seeing them in the 2000s. And what's interesting is how this kind of all comes together, because you all remember a game called Dungeons and Dragons. Dungeons and Dragons started as a board game. You knew the people you were playing with, and that was part of the fun of it. Is that you knew the people you were gaming with. But in the year 2000, what happened is the people who invented D&D, and I remember my son doing that. I mean, doing D&D and as a teenager. And the manual for Dungeons and Dragons makes the SPSS package that we found in graduate school look like Casper Mouse. I mean, it is a sophisticated set of instructions, and that mastering that manual is quite an accomplishment. They decided to make, as a gesture to the world and their success, that they're going to make their platform, that Dungeons and Dragons platform, became open source in the year 2000. And the first game out of the gate was called Baldur's Gate. And Baldur's Gate has now just come out in version 3, in which parenthetically you can be sexual with anybody who's playing with you online as part of it. When my medical director pointed that out to me, he says, yeah, and every character can be sexual with whoever they want in the game, only they do it digitally. You don't know who you're having sex with. Anyway, the point is that Baldur's Gate came out, and then a number of others came out. So the kids that are born around the year 2000, 1995, 2000, then it gained enough momentum. What happened in our culture is there was a turning point in 2014 to 2017. And the statistics that we've amassed is that this is but not about the pandemic. It's not about the pandemic. It's about that our culture shifted and pivoted, major pivot between 14 and 17. And when it did, the first sign of it was in 14, when the National Education Association reported their scores. And about a third of the students' scores were terrible. They went down dramatically. They couldn't read, they couldn't add, they would do math, write, spell words, and they were stunned. After years of growing achievement measured every year in the United States, suddenly there's a portion of our kids not doing well. And one of the things we know about is that they became problematic in this classroom. Sexual joking, sexual teasing of teachers, faculty starting to complain about that the environment in the classroom has changed. We know that other ways that we started to see that, and I have a list, there's about 20 things that happened between 2014 and 2000. Our longevity, we lost and continue to lose. We were one of the world leaders. We were up to 79 years and a half years would be the average age that you would live in the United States. We are now down to a little over 66, I think. But it dropped right in 2014. It just plummeted. Mass shootings. Unbelievable. Do you realize that there were more mass shootings between the year 2000 and 2014 than the entire 20th century? Mass shooting being defined as 4 people or more being killed. I could go on and we could spend this whole podcast talking about those 3 years and all the things. By the way, many of those shooters were children. Because in a game, and you shoot somebody, it's kind of like not real.
Yeah.
You get a gun, and it becomes a very different thing. But if it's in a game context, it's different. And it really hit its peak in 2017, 18. Then the pandemic came. Pandemic didn't help anything because what it did is it launched alcoholism into a whole new orbit. And the fact is that alcoholism, our bodies never evolved to be able to handle alcohol. I mean, there's a Mediterranean diet theory that if you have a glass of wine, that you're. The fact is that there's nothing good about putting alcohol in your body. It ultimately takes a toll on you. And the liquor industry has become one of the most profitable industries in our country and is still there. And it's affected college campuses because that's what Malcolm Gladwell was writing about when he was talking about first meetings of people and the judgments they make. And the fact is that 40% of our college students, freshmen and sophomores, have had a blackout in the last year. A blackout is an advanced stage of a symptom in alcoholism. So what we need to realize is that everything addictive has grown more, and it's because it's gotten younger. It's expanded in lots of them. The data is that now sexual compulsivity is listed in the ICD-11, and that's because there's no biomarkers. And in the sense that it's more behaviorally oriented, people can see that someone's in trouble, but is that compulsive behavior or addictive behavior? The World Health Organization was very smart because they hooked up, because porn addiction is a real addiction, and you can look at an MRI and you can see withdrawal. That's a physical symptom that a physician can hold on to. We haven't had that, but I don't have many porn addicts who also don't do a legion of other things at the same time. In other words, um, and we needed to have something, and we're seeing that now as we start to look at the dopaminergic. One of the characteristics of the new sex addict is that when they start using as much as they are using, what happens is that there is the serotonergic part of the system comes in, and what's laid down is what we call personality disorders and common pathologies, mental health problems, the worst of which is mood disorders and ultimately suicide and the suicidality of it. A lot of I believe, a lot of what are regarded as overdoses um, really are really about people being tired and not believing they could ever stop and get out of this whole world.
Yeah. Pat, I really appreciate it. It feels like this is a place to wrap up, but what what really strikes me about sort of everything that you've talked about today, which I really appreciate, is really laying out the breadth of the work that we have to do as sex addiction specialists these days. Because it's not just, hey, here's a behavior, we need to change it. It's, here's the behavior that brought you into our office. And now we're going to help not only shift the behavior, but we're going to help you to heal your neurology and help you to understand the impact that all this has had on your neurology. We're going to
Sure.
understand all the trauma and the childhood stuff, whether that's trauma based or whether that's super stimulus based, that got you here. We're going to do some of the most important work, which is helping you to find recovery and live your life differently so that you pass on as little of this to the next generation as possible. And those are the people that are working with us who are parents, that they can show up for their kids in a different way and provide a little bit of a buffer to their kids with all the stuff that's coming at our kids these days that is pushing them into addictive escaping.
There's a lot of criteria and things being suggested. Like, for example, we don't let kids drink if you're watching what you're doing under the age of 18 or what have you, having an iPad uh, only supervised after the age of 16. So one of the suggestions. I think the mental health community has to face this.
Yeah.
You have to face the fact that you can't take a kid out of their family that young and provide treatment without doing a whole total family approach to what's going on. That means our practices, what we do, has to change dramatically. And I ran a program for years, so I know this is possible. We took kids down to age 6. They had 35 contact hours and an outpatient basis. Thing was is that there are numbers of people in the family also had addictions. So you took care of all the addictions at once. But it wasn't as a good a way to make money as a hospital bed or even the 50-minute hour.
Yeah.
I'm really wanting to challenge the mental health community. This thing is going to run away with us. We have created a chart on conspiracy theories, denial, all the things that addiction does. They're acts overlays.
What is your hope? What is it that you're seeing, or what is it that we're finding that we're able to bring into it that gives you hope that we might be able to find a way through?
I think the hope is I think pharmacologically we can start to make a difference. I think the hope is if we can get it at early enough, we can screen and even be able to tell kids. The other hope that I have is that the flexibility within the mental health community is we can kind of reorganize how we deliver our services. Because right now what we do is there some of the best stuff that people can get, you have to have a lot of money to get to.
Yeah.
And it needs to come to somebody. It's so big, it needs to be available and less expensive than it, it would be. In other words, I see a lot of patients
Yeah.
where it's regarded as a luxury. This is not a luxury anymore.
Yeah. Pat, thank you so much for taking time to share all of this with us. I've heard many of these stories before, and I never get tired of hearing them. And I so appreciate you taking the time to share this, not with just us, but with the whole audience out there. I just find this so valuable.
Happy to be on and happy to help. Appreciate what you guys are doing because you're stirring up the dust, and we got to be able to see through this sandstorm, and you're helping with that by doing this podcast. So hopefully.
Thank you, Pat. Thank you
Thanks,
for
Pat.
being here.
Well,
You're
everyone out there, thank you so much for joining us today. Please go on wherever you are listening to us and rate us so that other people can find us more easily. And if anything came up in here that you've got questions about and you would like us to address it in a mailbag issue, go ahead and shoot us an email. The email for those is conversations.sar@gmail.com. Send those questions to us and we will gladly talk about them in a future mailbag episode. Thank
Do
you
they
so much.
do they get cups?
Big
Do they-
cups.
Did you get your mug, Pat?
I got a cup. Yeah.
Good.
Bacon
So-
cup.
Yes. And if you want to send us $5,000 for that low price, we will send you a Conversations mug free, just out of the goodness of our heart.
Thank you, Pat.
Thank
Thanks,
you all.
Pat. Appreciate it.